Hey guys. So after I had done my what I'm reading, books, magazines, and life video, oh by the way, the furnace did get fixed that day. The guy came by later on in the day with the part and fixed the furnace, so I'm all set there, thank goodness. But after I had done that video about books and magazines and life, I got a comment on that video where someone was saying that they were interested in what books were on the bookcase that I couldn't bear to part with. And I said, well, they wanted me to do a video about that. And I was like, well, that would be impossible to do a video about that many books because there's probably like 100 books on that bookcase. So I said, what if I do a top 10 favorite books of all time? And they said, yeah, that sounds good. That way also I figured I could talk a little bit about each one. And by the way, if you're watching this video and you're thinking to yourself, why isn't she doing makeup videos anymore? Why is she doing these book videos? Don't worry, this is just sort of a continuation of that video from the other day that seemed like a logical thing. I thought to go from what I'm reading now to my top 10 favorite books of all time, but after this I will definitely be doing more makeup videos. But anyways, yeah, let's get right into it because I do have 10 different books to talk about. And they are fiction and non-fiction books because that's what I read. I read a mixture of everything. There is not a category that I don't hit. And you know what? Before I even get started on the 10 on the table in front of me, there is one book that I read that I had taken out from the library that I have to include in this list, even though that would make it 11 books. And that is the biography that was written about Steve Jobs. I believe the author was Walter Isaacson. I'm pretty sure it was Walter Isaacson. But if you like biographies or if you have an Apple computer, you need to read that book because it was so good. It was so interesting because it doesn't just take you through Steve Jobs' life. It takes you through the whole progression of the Apple company. And even if you don't have an Apple computer, by the time you finish reading that book, you're going to want one because it was such a struggle for him in the beginning to make that company a success because at that time, everybody that had a computer had a Windows-based Microsoft operating system, and to try to break through that and do something different at that time was next to impossible. But somehow he managed to do it with a lot of determination and ingenuity. And so yeah, if you like biographies, that was probably the best biography I've ever read. So I definitely recommend that book and have to include it in this list. Now, the first thing I'm going to start with is cookbooks. I enjoy cooking and I kind of jump around and make different kinds of things. I did do a video already called My Favorite Cookbook, and in that video I talked about the book Eating Economically is Just Plain Smart by Mary Jane and Jeff Cardarelle-Hermans. So if you want more information about this book, then I would suggest watching that video. It was called My Favorite Cookbook. This is out of print though, unfortunately, so you can't get it, but there could be a library or an eBay situation or Amazon where you might be able to get it. But yeah, just watch that video because I talk extensively about this cookbook, which I love. The other cookbook that I have that I love is my Betty Crocker cookbook, and I've had this for about 30 years, 40 years. I've had it a long time. The back cover is off. The binding is gone. I tried to tape it at one time. The tape dried up and fell off. They still make this cookbook, and I probably could go to a bookstore at any time and buy the same thing, but maybe a slightly different edition. But this is fantastic, and I don't replace it because, I don't know, it has sentimental value because it is falling apart and I've had it for 30 or 40 years. But the reason why I love this so much, other than the fact that it has great recipes in it, is there's a reference section at the end on vegetables. And if you like to cook a wide variety of vegetables and you're not exactly sure how to prepare them or how many minutes to cook them, all you have to do is go to the vegetable section, and they're alphabetized A to Z. And so if you want to know how to cook and how many minutes to cook any type of vegetable from artichokes to zucchini, all you have to do is go to that section in the end and it will tell you. Because a lot of people, when they cook vegetables, they just kind of wing it. I would rather just set a timer and not have to think about it and not have to go over and test it to see if it's done and all that. I would just rather move on to something else and not have to babysit vegetables when I'm cooking them. So I love that vegetable section in the back. Plus they have recipes if you don't want to just eat a plain vegetable. They have recipes on how to make any given vegetable more interesting, by using it in a recipe instead of just boiling it or baking it or whatever you would do to your vegetables. So that's why I love this cookbook so much, but it does have some really great recipes, regular recipes in there too. Okay, in my video about what I'm reading, I was talking about how I'm reading the Wizard of Oz series, and I would be remiss if I did not mention another children's book that is one of my all-time favorites, and that is, and somebody mentioned this in the comment section the other day, that they had always meant to read this. Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass are two novels that are condensed into this particular version. How great of an illustration is that? This is by Lewis Carroll. It's a classic, so if you're interested in reading it, just go to the classics section of a children's department's bookstore, and I'm sure you will find a version of this. I didn't care for the Through the Looking Glass as much as I did the original Alice in Wonderland story, but this is a must-read. Even if you're an adult, I think you would enjoy this because it's full of metaphors and symbolism, and you'll see beyond the story of what it really means and what it really is. I mean, when you're a kid, you take this at face value and it's still interesting and fun, but when you get older, you can kind of read into the double meaning that is going on in a lot of portions of the story. So this is a must read if you've never read it. Now let's move on to fantasy and horror. And when it comes to fantasy, how can you go wrong with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? So the book that I'm holding up from that is The Hobbit. This is what started it all. I don't know if The Hobbit was released first. I think The Lord of the Rings might have been released first, and then this was sort of an afterthought. I'm not sure. But you should start with The Hobbit because it's what predates the story of Lord of the Rings. I have this really nice leather-bound book that is in a protective case, and it's just a really nice edition that I had picked up at one time. I read the paperbacks first for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and then I read them again, and then they fell apart, and then I inherited my father's paperback versions, and my father is deceased, so I got all his paperbacks when he died, and so I already have another set of the paperbacks if I want to read them again in paperback form. But I had somewhere along the lines I had picked up this nice leather bound edition. But I think everybody's pretty much familiar with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings because of the movies. But if you've only seen the movies and you haven't read the books, you should definitely read them. They're well worth it, and I think you would really enjoy them. Next up is horror. When it comes to horror, one of the first horror writers was H.P. Lovecraft. I think most people know Edgar Allan Poe, but not everybody knows H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft was from Rhode Island, and I live in Massachusetts, but I live very close to Rhode Island, and so I sort of have a soft spot for this author because he was local. And he wrote a lot of short stories, and this particular book, I think this is still in print, I'm not sure, but hopefully it is. The book that I have of his is called At the Mountains of Madness and Other Tales of Terror. This book contains, I feel, his best work because it's a compilation of At the Mountains of Madness, The Shunned House, The Dreams in the Witch House, and The Statement of Randolph Carter. But I've read some of his other stuff. I think I had taken it out from the library or I had traded it in. At one time I used to buy books from a used bookstore and I would read them and then bring them back and get a credit towards my next purchase and just keep doing that over and over again so that I didn't have to pay quite as much to read them. So there are hundreds and hundreds of books that I've read that I have since forgotten about. But anyways, this is a horror author that doesn't get as much recognition as like Edgar Allan Poe did, or like a Stephen King or something, which I like them too, but I'm just saying that if you haven't read anything by this author, you should, because he was brilliant. And he and Edgar Allan Poe were friends, and they had a the type of friendship they had was they would write letters back and forth to each other. And so yeah, if you've never read anything by this author and you like horror, then I highly recommend this book or something that has At the Mountains of Madness in it, because that's a really good story. There are other stories he's written though that are really good too. Another author that I think a lot of you would have heard of if you like horror is Anne Rice. The very first book I ever read by Anne Rice was Interview with the Vampire. And again, you know, a lot of you may have seen the movies that this series was based on, or that the movies were based on. This is the series that inspired the movies. If you've never read anything by Anne Rice, just read this first book in the in her vampire series. If this doesn't grab you, then she is not for you, but I really like Anne Rice as an author, and I've read most of her books. Not all of them, but most of them. And she isn't someone that gets talked about that much anymore, but this is classic because there's this and then it goes to Vampire Lestat and on and on and on. And the series just continues. Plus she's written a bunch of other books. Her witch type books were also really interesting. And so yeah, this is definitely something I would never get rid of. Now we move on to what is left are nonfiction books. Well, they're supposed to be nonfiction, and I say that because there are two books here that are somewhat controversial because some people think that they're not nonfiction. Some people think that they are fiction, but they were written as nonfiction books, and whether they are or not, we'll never really know for sure. But let me start with, let's start with those two. This is called The Third Eye, and it's by T. Lobsang Rampa. And I thought this book was out of print, but it's not. It's still in print. But if you are interested in any kind of spiritual, metaphysical type stuff, if that's a subject that interests you, you would probably really enjoy this. What this is, without really giving anything away, this is supposedly a man who is, let's see, how can I describe this? You know what, I'm just gonna see what their description is on the back of the book, because what my interpretation of it is may not be the same. It just says T. Lobsang Rampa was preordained to be a Tibetan priest. a sign from the stars that could not be ignored. When he left his wealthy home to enter the monastery, his heart was filled with trepidation, with only a slight knowledge of the rigorous spiritual training and physical ordeal that awaited him. This is his story, a hauntingly beautiful and deeply inspiring journey of awakening within Chakpuri Lamasery, the temple of Tibetan medicine. It is a moving tale of passage through the mystic arts of astral projection, crystal gazing, aura deciphering, meditation, and more. A spiritual guide of enlightenment and discovery through the opening of the all-powerful, the all-knowing. I don't like that description. It's so much more interesting than the way they described it there. If you like metaphysical New Age type things, read this book. It's really, really good, and you won't be able to put it down. And it's not a big book either. It's fairly small paperback. Okay, next up is Carlos Castaneda. Does that name ring a bell? If you're younger than me, you probably have no idea who he is. He was supposedly, and I say that because there is some controversy surrounding this guy as well, because T. Lobsang Rampa, there's a lot more to that. If you just Google that, I'll put all the names of these books and the authors' names, and there's some controversy surrounding both these authors, the last one I just talked about and this one. And if you just type those names into, do a Google search and then put controversy, you can read all the backstory behind the controversy surrounding these authors. But anyways, Carlos Castaneda was really popular in the 60s, and the very first book of his that I ever read was not the first one. It was Journey to Ixtlan. And the whole idea with this author is that he was on a spiritual journey of sorts. He was wandering in the desert in Mexico and came across an old man who was a shaman. And from there, he went on a spiritual journey with this man who tried to teach him everything that he knew about his spiritual beliefs. And the man that he met was a tribal elder of a Central American race of people. Like, okay, in the United States we have Native Americans, and in Mexico and Central America, South America, they also have their own Indian tribes of people who have been on these continents since the beginning of time, and they all have their own unique belief system. Well, he taught this Carlos Castaneda everything he knew, and then he proceeded to write dozens, I think, books. I've read most of them, but this is the one that got me interested in it in the first place, and it's fantastic. But I would say start with the first one, which was called, I think, The Teachings of Don Juan. I believe that was the name of the first one, but this is the one that I started with, so I figured I would show this one. But it gets really, really wild and crazy and intense, and there's drug experimentation. He's eating like psychedelic mushrooms as he's learning all these things, and it's pretty interesting stuff, and I really enjoyed that. Okay, now let's move on to some religious books. Something you should know about me is that my belief system is all over the place. If I had to categorize it, but I don't like labels, but if I had to categorize it, I would say it could be categorized as either New Age or agnostic, because I believe that there is worth in all the religions and spiritual teachings that exist in the world, and that we can learn something from everyone, no matter who they are or what they believe in. Now, I know religion is a very touchy subject, and I think that's why I've never brought it up before, but that's how I feel, and I think it's important to respect other people's belief systems and not criticize them. People get very funny about religion. I've noticed just by, things that have happened in the world, that some people are so convinced that it's their way or the highway, that if you don't believe the way they do, that not only are you wrong, but you, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this without it coming across in a violent way, but I mean, that's the world we live in. There are a lot of people that if you don't believe the way they believe, they get violent about it. So, but I think that, you know, there is worth and importance in all the beliefs, religious and spiritual. And the reason why I say that is I've studied all the major religions, but I've also studied alternative type belief systems such as witchcraft and shamanism and, you know, Aboriginal Native American beliefs, but I also know a little moderate amount about Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. So I've read a lot of books on religion and spirituality. It's just a subject that fascinates me, but I consider myself to be either an agnostic or someone who is like a new ager. So that's just how it is. So the books that I pulled from my shelf that I've enjoyed the most are now keep in mind everything that I just said. The Bhagavad-Gita, which is a Hindu holy scripture type book. When I read this the first time, I was totally blown away by it. I've got all kinds of notes and underlining sentences and paragraphs and reference, and this whole thing has got all my own personal notes in it. I read this several times and I thought it was amazing. And another book that kind of goes with that is the Upanishads. I didn't enjoy this as much as the Bhagavad-Gita, but they sort of go hand in hand because they're both like holy scripture for Hinduism. So really, really enjoyed those. And in Buddhism, I have this book called The Little Zen Companion. And what this is it's quotes by Buddhists of all walks of life. And what's fun about this book is you can just like thumb through it and open it randomly to a page and then just read that one page in that moment. And it's not all strictly Zen Buddhism quotes. There are some quotes in here that kind of straddle the line between all religions, because the page that it opened up to, I'm just going to read to you what it says. It says, God made everything out of nothing, but the nothingness shows through. And the quote is by Paul Valery, or Valery, V-A-L-E-R-Y. And so there's all kinds of cool quotes in this book. That's The Little Zen Companion by David Schiller. So, you know, it's hard to pin it down to just 10 books or 11, because I did mention the Steve Jobs biography, but these are 10 books that I would grab off the shelf first if I only had seconds before a fire or something to grab some books, because I really love all these books. But I have a lot of books that I also love equally, but these were the ones that I felt like made the most profound impact on me, or that I refer to the most, like, you know, the cookbooks and whatnot. So those are my 10 favorite books of all time, sort of. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.